Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. They say Hollow Brook is the kind of place where the trees lean in a little closer when secrets are spoken, and the fog doesn't lift so much as it lingers, as if listening. Life there moves at the pace of a creaking wheel, slow, steady, and never without the sound of something old turning underfoot. The hills surrounding the village rise like folded arms, guarding whatever ancient sorrow might sleep beneath the soil. Folks live with simple names, simple trades, and even simpler expectations. A marriage here, a child there, a harvest praised or cursed depending on the year. Gossip is the language of comfort, and silence is rarely just silence. It's suspicion dressed in stillness. In Hollow Brook, when a stranger arrives, the wind shifts just enough for the crows to circle twice before settling again. Time itself seems cautious. This was the place Edric Maloran called home, not because he chose it, but because generations before him had worn paths through its muddy veins and left no trail out. He was known not for wealth or title, but for the strength of his back and the honesty of his work. In a place where nothing ever changed, he was the kind of man people stopped noticing, until he did something they didn't expect. Edric was carved more than born, shaped by years of labor and the quiet authority of those who listen more than they speak. His arms bore the marks of decades with axe and chisel, and his eyes had the calm of someone who knew what it meant to be needed, but never celebrated. He built homes that wouldn't crumble and mended roofs before the storm came. People trusted his hands, even if they never really looked him in the eye while thanking him. That was Edric's place in the village, a man who stood behind others in line, but was first called when things fell apart. He had no flair for jokes, no appetite for drink that pushed him into wild laughter, but he was steady, reliable. And sometimes the most dangerous kind of man is the one who is underestimated even by himself. That was why when Edric returned from the hills one storm-washed evening with a woman no one had seen before, cloaked in rain and silence, it was as though someone had turned the sky upside down. No carriage had brought her. No letter had announced her. She came on foot, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that clung to her like seaweed, her face half covered by the hood. Edric's neighbors watched from behind curtains and cracked doors as he led her to his threshold, one hand hovering protectively near her shoulder, not touching her, but not letting her stray. The wind pushed against them both like it was trying to undo whatever brought them together. And when Edric turned and said, almost casually, that this woman was to be his wife, not one villager believed he had spoken in full sense. There had been no courtship, no engagement, no talk at the inn of love or longing. Yet there she stood, soaked to the bone, silent as a sealed letter. Some claimed she had the look of a widow still in mourning. Others said her eyes flickered like she remembered too much. But no one asked her name. They only nodded slowly and whispered later, when the doors were closed and the oil lamps were low. Maeve, that's what Edric called her, never corrected him, nor did she offer a surname. The name floated through the village like a scent no one could place. It didn't sound like theirs, didn't root itself in the local tongue, and perhaps that alone was enough to make people wary. She spoke with the rhythm of someone who had known many silences, and when she did speak, it was never to explain herself. She asked no favors, attended no gatherings, and rarely stepped beyond the cottage they shared. When she did appear, it was in the early hours or just after dusk, carrying water or herbs, always moving as if she were not walking on roads, but over the memory of them. Children said she smelled like rain before it fell. Wives frowned at her bare hands and strange-colored dresses. Husbands, though, some of them glanced twice and then looked away. There was a stillness in Maeve that unsettled the village, a quiet so deep it made others hear their own thoughts too clearly. and Hollow Brook was not a place that liked to listen to itself for long. Maeve heard the names they gave her, not in shouts, but in the way windows closed when she walked past, in the way conversations quieted with unnatural precision. There was always a peculiar stillness before someone said her name, as if the wind itself held its breath. The people of Hollowbrook didn't speak cruelty aloud. They scattered it like seed in a field, letting it take root in glances, gestures, and the twitch of a smile. The leech, some whispered, too softly to be caught, yet always loud enough to be felt. The shadow wife, others said, spinning their tales from the invisible thread of their own discomfort. But Maeve never responded. She moved through the village like a wisp on the edge of a dream, her eyes never lingering too long on anyone, her hands never idle but never busy with things others deemed valuable. She did not bake loaves for public raffles. She did not laugh loudly at the well. She did not pretend to be one of them, and that alone made them distrust her. When she carried water from the river, children stared and mothers pulled them back, not from danger but from difference. Her presence became a question no one wanted to ask, but everyone resented not answering. And when the sun slipped behind the hills, no matter what light still lingered, the villagers would say the day had ended once Maeve passed by. Edric saw the shifts, though he never admitted it aloud. He noticed the way people looked through her, as if she were made of glass and mist, something to be endured but never embraced. At first, he had tried to defend her. When Griff mocked her quiet nature, Edric would laugh stiffly but not join in. When Ronan asked what she even did all day, Edric's brow would tighten, and his lips would part as if to answer, only to close again without a sound. It was easier not to speak than to say the wrong thing. Silence became his armor, and in time, even that began to rust. The weight of ridicule, though light at first, settled into his bones like the chill of an unwelcome winter. He began to repeat their words, not proudly, but not unwillingly either. "She just sits," he muttered one night, not to anyone in particular. "Watches the hills like they're going to tell her something." The more he said it, the more he believed it. It was easier to echo the village than to explain her. And once, at the inn, when the drink made his tongue too loose, he spoke the word he'd never dared say before. "Leech." He said it with a bitter chuckle, not looking up. The room erupted in laughter, and no one noticed how Edric gripped his cup a little tighter than before. It is written that the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity, and that night his burned away whatever tenderness he'd once known. Back in their cottage, the silence between them had grown into something with breath and weight, something that moved through the rooms like an unwelcome guest. Maeve never confronted him, not with words, at least. She still prepared his bread, though now it was often stale by the time he touched it. She still lit the hearth, but the fire burned low and tired. Her hands, once gentle in their stillness, now rested more often in her lap, fingers laced like someone trying to remember how to pray. She spoke less, moved slower, and kept her gaze far from his. When he came home, the air didn't greet him with warmth or fragrance. It waited, still and hollow, as though deciding whether to receive him at all. It was as if her eyes had grown weary of being windows, and had shuttered themselves entirely. Still, she fulfilled her duties in quiet ways, ways that made it harder to complain, harder to accuse. But the absence of affection was louder than any argument. It echoed in the creak of the floorboards, in the untouched bowl of broth, in the way the bed felt larger than it should. What grew between them was not hate, it was distance, stretched so thin it no longer needed effort to exist. Like a shadow cast at dusk, it simply was. The villagers had stopped asking after Maeve. Her name became something spoken only when needed, and even then, it carried the weight of an old rumor. Once, when Edric passed the inn alone, someone asked where his wife had gone. He simply shrugged, though she had been at home that very morning, kneeling before the hearth, pressing her palm to the stones as though listening to something beneath them. He didn't mention it. There was a part of him that had grown used to pretending she wasn't there, or perhaps never had been. He couldn't decide which felt more honest. The guilt came not in floods, but in drizzles, little stings that pricked him when he saw her old satchel untouched, or her empty chair by the window. Still, pride is a strange drug. It dulls the ache until it convinces the body it was never wounded. And so Edric walked straighter when spoken to, laughed louder when others watched. He let himself believe the story others told about Maeve, because it fit more neatly into their world than the truth. Every wise woman buildeth her house, the scripture says, but the foolish plucketh it down with her hands. Yet what of the man who lets others burn the foundation, while he stands and smiles? The morning the messenger arrived, Hollow Brook was already humming with the early stirrings of harvest season. Fields were being readied for the scythe, and the air carried the scent of turned earth and distant smoke. But when the hooves of the envoy's horse cracked the dry stones of the village path, conversation died mid-sentence, and spades froze in the soil. He wore the emerald sigil of House Brendale on his cloak, a falcon with wings stretched across a rising sun. To Hollow Brook, such a visitor was as rare as snowfall in midsummer. The rider dismounted with the ease of someone trained in discipline and ceremony. Without much flourish, he reached into his satchel and produced a scroll, tied with golden twine and stamped in crimson wax. Curious eyes peered from windows, and cautious feet crept closer. By the decree of Lord Brendale, Warden of the Southern Reach and Guardian of the Hill Provinces, the man read aloud, "You are hereby invited to the Harvest Ball, to be held on the first moon of autumn." The villagers were stunned. They had heard tales of such feasts, but never been summoned themselves. Invitations like these were for noble kin, merchant families, or skilled courtiers, not farmers and carpenters. But the letter was clear. All citizens of the southern villages were welcome, including Hollow Brook. And with that, the messenger rolled his scroll, remounted his horse, and vanished as swiftly as he'd come, leaving only a whisper of excitement in his wake. Edric sat on the edge of his workbench that evening, his hands streaked with sawdust, his brow still damp from labor. He held the news like a stone in his palm, weighty and full of implication. The Harvest Ball was not simply a gathering. It was spectacle, theater, and opportunity sewn together beneath candlelight and silk. It was the kind of place where a common man might be mistaken for someone greater if he dressed the part and carried his spine well. For Edric, the invitation crackled in his chest like fire against dry wood. At the inn, Ronan had already begun imagining himself dancing with a baron's daughter, recounting how he'd charm her with tales of his imaginary ancestry. Silas bragged about polishing his grandfather's sword just to wear it across his belt like some long-lost soldier. Even Griff, whose laugh had always been louder than his logic, spoke of lace-trimmed collars and goblets of mulled wine. Edric listened, half smiling, but inside a strange hunger grew. Not for riches or romance, but recognition. He wanted, no, needed, to be seen as something more than the man who fixed fences and hoisted beams. The village knew his hands, but not his worth. Maybe at the ball they would see both. That night, as the sky faded into ash and the stars blinked like ancient eyes, he walked home with shoulders slightly straighter than before, rehearsing in his mind what he might wear, what he might say, and what others might finally see in him. He told Maeve as the last light dipped beneath the hill, standing in the doorway with his voice carefully measured. "There's a ball," he said, as though commenting on the weather. She was by the hearth, sorting dried herbs with slender fingers, her motion slow and deliberate, as if the task itself held secrets only she could read. She did not pause, nor did she look up. For a moment Edric thought she might not have heard. He cleared his throat. "We've been invited. All of Hollow Brook." She placed a sprig of marjoram on the table, then glanced at him. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. "We?" The word came softly, not accusingly, but with a gentleness that made Edric suddenly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight. "If you want to come," he muttered, then added, "you can." But the tone betrayed him. It was not a beckoning, not a gesture of inclusion. It was obligation, reluctant and uncertain. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and returned to her herbs. He didn't speak again that night. They ate in silence, the only sound between them the soft crunch of leaves beneath her fingers, and the wind tapping against the window like a question left unanswered. As the days passed, the village swelled with preparation. The tailor's cottage became a hive of frantic activity, women stitching lace, men being measured for the first time in years. Old chests were opened, and long-forgotten brooches and ribbons saw light again. Even the cobbler, who rarely smiled, began humming a cheerful tune as he shaped fresh soles with unusual care. Excitement buzzed like bees in a clover field, and no one could speak without mentioning the ball. Edric found himself caught in the current. He traded 3 chairs and a carved mantelpiece for a new pair of boots and a burgundy vest lined with satin. He stood before the cracked mirror in his workshop more than once, adjusting the angle of his collar or smoothing his hair with wet fingers. He didn't speak of Maeve, not to his friends, not to the tailor, not even to himself. Her absence in these conversations felt natural now, like something long accepted. Maeve, for her part, made herself scarce. She no longer gathered herbs near the well or traded quietly with the apothecary. Her presence faded from village view like a shadow at dusk. Still, Edric didn't question it. Perhaps he assumed she wouldn't come. Perhaps he hoped. But on the eve of the ball, as he oiled his boots and packed a spare shirt with a kind of reverent anticipation, he looked up once to see her standing in the doorway of their small room. She said nothing, only watched, her expression unreadable, her silence louder than any refusal. Hollowbrook became something it had not been in years, restless. A kind of hunger stirred among the people, not for food or coin, but for validation, spectacle, and story. News of the upcoming harvest ball bloomed like fire across dry grass. It jumped from field to field, whispered through hedgerows, echoed across the cobbled paths, and settled beneath thatched roofs. From every corner of the village came the clatter of hammers, the hiss of irons, and the rhythmic thrum of sewing needles against stretched linen. It was a frenzy of preparation disguised as civility. No one wanted to admit they were desperate to be seen, but every second glance at a mirror told the truth. Ronan walked with a puff chest and newly oiled boots, his words suddenly littered with names of noble houses he'd only read about in forgotten almanacs. Silas practiced tilting his chin like the lords in old paintings, believing posture alone could elevate his standing. Even Griff, who had once said nothing in this world could impress him, had commissioned a waistcoat dyed in the color of deep copper, a shade he claimed brought out the golden flecks in his eyes. Pride draped itself over the village like a velvet curtain, and no one noticed how quickly the old humility was being folded and tucked away, out of sight. The air smelled of ambition, and even the children played at bowing and curtsying in the dust, as if their games could summon titles from thin air. Edric found himself swept along in the same undercurrent. It wasn't that he had planned to impress anyone, not at first, but there was something about the energy of the village, the way people looked forward with open eyes instead of down at their feet, that began to pull him from his usual pace. He visited the tailor's house and stood still while his shoulders were measured, only half smiling as the man whistled at how broad they were. He bartered his finest work, a carved banister of rosewood with delicate inlays, for a vest lined in dark plum satin, a color rich enough to draw the eye, but subtle enough not to beg for it. Each day, he cleaned his boots more often than necessary, rubbed his jaw longer in the mirror as if deciding whether to shave clean or leave just enough stubble to seem deliberate. He spoke with more ease around Ronan and Silas, nodded in agreement when they dreamed aloud of who they might meet, what noble favors might fall into their laps. Yet beneath it all, something restless stirred in Edric, not pride exactly, but a longing to shed his skin, not to become someone else, but to be seen differently, if only for one night. For years, he had been the man people turned to only when things were broken. He wondered what it would feel like to walk into a room and have eyes turned before anything had fallen apart. This question lingered in his bones, humming faintly as he polished buttons and practiced half-smiles in the slanting light of dusk. In all of this, he never once spoke to Maeve about the details. She remained a quiet presence in the home, though one he seemed to glance past rather than toward. There were moments she might have asked how his preparations were going, but she did not. And there were moments he could have asked her if she'd need anything for the ball, but the words never formed. It was a strange dance of avoidance, each of them stepping around the other like strangers forced to share the same floor. On the morning before the ball, Edric sat at the small kitchen table, counting the coins in his hand and debating whether he had enough left for gloves. Maeve was nearby, standing by the open window with the breeze teasing strands of her hair. She did not speak, only watched the horizon, where the hills gathered like shoulders beneath a cloak of blue sky. Her expression was calm but unreadable, like a woman listening to something beyond human sound. Edric glanced at her once, wondering if she was still thinking of coming, but he said nothing. He convinced himself it didn't matter. He told himself she wouldn't want to go, that the ball was no place for someone who had never cared for company. He used her quiet against her, making it the reason not to reach out. And in that final day before the carriages would leave, their house seemed filled not with anticipation, but with the tension of two people waiting for different things while pretending they were waiting for nothing at all. That evening, the sun lowered behind the hills with a slowness that seemed almost ceremonial. The sky flushed with deep orange and faded into a violet so rich it looked like bruised silk. In the village square, lanterns were being prepared, their frames made of thin willow and pale paper, each one painted with delicate scenes of harvests and dances past. The laughter of neighbors rang louder than usual, spurred on by the nervous thrill of expectation. But back at the Maloran home, the air was strangely still. Edric sat alone near the hearth, gently oiling his boots with steady hands, the scent of wax and leather rising like memory. His new vest hung neatly from a wooden peg, and his shirt had been laid out across the bed, pressed flat with more care than he had shown anything in weeks. Still, he could not shake the feeling that something in the room was unfinished. He rose and stepped into the hall, looking briefly toward the room Maeve often sat in. The door was slightly ajar, but no light shone through. He paused, unsure if he should knock, call her name, or simply walk away. A breath caught in his throat, not out of fear, but hesitation. There was something in him that wanted her to come, though he had never admitted it aloud. He stepped back and returned to his boots. When she finally did emerge, it was not with ceremony or fanfare. She stood in the hallway, her face unreadable in the fading light. She said nothing, only looked at him for a long, long moment. And in that silence, Edric felt more seen than he had in all the weeks of laughter at the inn. Still, he turned back to his task without a word. The weight of what had not been said hung in the air like the scent of rain, present, thick, and refusing to be ignored. The Brendale estate stood like a memory no one had lived but everyone believed in, tall spires rising against the dusk like the fingers of a long-forgotten prayer, each stone too deliberate to be merely decorative. The gate, made of dark iron laced with copper vinework, had been polished until the lanterns reflected against it like liquid flame. As the procession of carriages and foot travelers arrived, the great doors swung open slowly, revealing a courtyard paved in patterned stone, lanterns dangling from trees, so old their roots had braided into the bones of the land itself. Music drifted outward like smoke, violins and low drums, threaded through with the occasional hum of a pipe. notes that moved like silk and carried the weight of old wealth and older stories. The villagers of Hollow Brook stood uncertain at first, adjusting sleeves, straightening their backs, murmuring too loudly in the presence of silence they didn't yet understand. But as they stepped into the estate, the grandeur folded around them like a cloak they weren't sure they were allowed to wear. Marble columns greeted them, each one carved with images of harvest gods whose names had long since slipped from memory, and chandeliers hung like galaxies above a floor so polished it held their reflections more clearly than the sky held stars. None of them had ever walked through such halls before, not even in their dreams, and yet that night they entered not as trespassers, but as guests, or so they hoped. Edric found his place among the crowd with a kind of practiced uncertainty. He wore his plum-colored vest, his boots so freshly shined they creaked with each careful step. He kept his hands folded in front of him and let his gaze move from one ornate corner of the room to another, as if searching for something to anchor himself to. Ronan was already 2 cups into the evening, gesturing wildly as he retold a story about a wild dog he once tamed, though Edric remembered it had only been a goat. Silas lingered near the wine, adjusting his sash every few seconds, trying to look disinterested in the noblewomen passing by. Griff, ever the loudest among them, had taken it upon himself to flirt with a woman who clearly hadn't heard a word he said. Around them, the room shimmered with the kind of light that made everyone look better, feel better, speak as though the tongue had been dipped in honey. Edric smiled when expected, nodded at those he didn't recognize, and kept his thoughts tethered to his chest. But the truth was, he felt small, not because he didn't belong, but because he suddenly wanted to. There was something about the estate, the music, the way laughter echoed through vaulted ceilings, that made a man long to be admired, if only for a night. Yet even amid the dancing and silk and candlelight, there was one question pressing at the back of his mind. Had she come? He didn't hear the doors open again, not truly, but he felt something shift in the air. A hush, subtle but certain, passed through the room, like the exhale before a storm. Heads began to turn slowly, then all at once, and a silence bloomed at the threshold as though time itself had paused in reverence. And then she appeared. Maeve stepped into the hall with the stillness of moonlight spilling through an open window. Her dress was not like the others, a fabric not born of any local loom, but something weightless, like the shimmer of water at dusk. It moved with her as if alive, catching the light but refusing to reflect it back. Around her throat lay a necklace made of the skyroot flowers she once gathered near the hills, each petal impossibly fresh, faintly glowing with a hue that belonged to dreams more than nature. Her hair was gathered low, simple yet flawless, and her skin carried the soft gleam of someone untouched by the world's rough hands. She did not smile. She did not look around for approval. She walked as though she already knew her place. And for the first time, the nobles looked at someone from Hollow Brook with eyes that did not squint in judgment, but widened in awe. She was not merely present, she belonged. No one spoke. No one dared. And when she reached Edric, her voice, though quiet, broke the silence like morning light cracks through frost. "Shall we dance, husband?" she asked, and it was not a question of invitation, but of restoration. He took her hand with fingers that trembled more than they should have, not from fear, but from the sudden knowledge of what he had forgotten. Her palm was cool, not cold, and it fit his as though they had never stopped belonging to each other. As they stepped onto the floor, the musicians, uncertain for a moment, resumed their playing, slower now, more deliberate, as if watching them for tempo. They danced not like practiced partners, but like people who had once danced in silence, beneath low ceilings and colder nights. Her movements were fluid, unhurried, and each step carried a weight he could not name. When Edric looked into her face, he saw no pride there, no triumph, only calm and something older than disappointment. Around them, conversation resumed, but not as it had been. They were not the butt of jokes now, not the subjects of laughter. His friends, Ronan, Silas, Griff, all stood at the edge of the hall, their mouths slightly open, their pride unraveling thread by thread. For the first time, Edric did not wish to be noticed for his vest or his boots or the way he had arrived. He only wanted to keep holding her hand. For in that moment, she was not the woman the village had named. She was something else, something seen only once and never forgotten. And he, for the first time in memory, saw her not as a wife he had married, but as the woman he had been given, a gift he had misunderstood until she opened it herself. The following morning, Hollow Brook wore the weight of silence the way a widow wears a veil, tight, solemn, and unspoken. The sky had turned pale with the early gray of dawn, a hush pressed against the roofs and trees, as though the land itself were too reverent to speak. The townsfolk, returning from the ball the night before, now walked with softer footsteps, their laughter trimmed at the edges, their gossip muted. Those who had seen her, Maeve, enter Lord Brendale's estate could not stop replaying the image in their minds, the gown, the glow, the unearthly grace. What she was, no one dared say aloud. Theories bloomed in the corners of conversation like fungi growing where the light couldn't reach. Some said she must be of noble blood, cast out from some ancient line and hiding among the common. Others whispered about the old stories, the ones about the Hollow Ones, the watchers in the hills, spirits who sometimes took human form to test the hearts of men. One child claimed she saw Maeve's feet never truly touch the floor when she danced. Another swore the skyroot necklace had pulsed with light when Edric placed his hand on her back. But rumors, once loosed, are never caught again. They live on, change shape, grow teeth. And though no two villagers agreed on what they had seen, they all knew one thing: Maeve was no longer invisible. And whatever she had been to Edric before, she was now something else entirely in the eyes of Hollowbrook. Edric sat at the table that morning with his head in his hands. The cup before him had gone cold, untouched since it was poured. The walls of the cottage seemed smaller now, the corners sharper, the hearth quieter than he remembered. Everything inside him felt mismatched, regret and wonder stirring like river stones scraping together in a current he couldn't stop. He had always thought of himself as a man of sense, a man who saw things plainly. Yet now, faced with the memory of her walking into that grand hall, he felt as if he had missed something vital, not for a day or a week, but for years. He had called her a leech, not once, but many times. Maybe not always aloud, but often enough in his heart that the rot had spread from thought to word, from word to silence. He had not defended her. He had not asked her what she needed. He had, in the presence of his friends, fed the fire of their mockery, just to keep from feeling the chill of their judgment. And now, when he remembered her hand in his, how still it had felt, how certain, he wished more than anything that he had never opened his mouth the way he had. He stared at the door, half hoping she would step through it again, just as she had when she arrived long ago. But the house remained quiet. Her room was empty. Her presence, once so quietly constant, had left not with sound, but with finality. And in that silence, he began to understand something he had never let himself see. The weight of a gift does not lie in its glitter, but in how carefully it is carried. He waited until the sky began to shift into afternoon light before stepping outside. The hills stood distant and still, bathed in a calm that made the wind seem careful with its breath. Edric walked without a destination, his boots moving across soil that felt unfamiliar beneath his feet, though he had treaded his entire life. Every bend of the path reminded him of some forgotten word she had spoken, some motion she had made that he had once overlooked. He followed the old trail near the base of the western ridge, the one Maeve had often wandered before she withdrew into her silences. He had never thought to ask where she went or what she saw there. He had assumed, as men often do, that what he didn't understand couldn't matter. But now he looked more closely. The way the moss grew in perfect spirals against the stone, the arrangement of wildflowers that seemed too precise to be accidental, the faint traces of footprints near the brook that hadn't yet been washed away. She had lived here, fully, quietly, deeply. And he had lived beside her like a man who sleeps in the sun and never notices how warm it is until it's gone. As he reached the bend where the trees opened into a small glade, he saw something that stopped him mid-step. The ground there was carpeted in fresh skyroot. Hundreds of the soft blue petals fanned out in an almost perfect ring, glowing faintly beneath the canopy of green. He stepped into the circle slowly, knees bending, fingers brushing the petals. They were cool, alive, untouched by frost or flame. And he realized, with a sharpness that pulled the breath from his chest, that she had left this for him, not as a farewell, but as a final reminder that what is unseen still exists. He returned to the cottage just as the evening light began to fold over the hills, casting long shadows through the windows and painting the floorboards in fading gold. Everything inside was as he had left it, her satchel by the hearth, her shawl still draped over the back of the chair, the faintest scent of lavender hanging in the air. He moved through the room as though stepping into a church, each creak of the floorboard a psalm, each breath a quiet prayer. He stopped by the window where she once sat and watched the hills. He knelt there, not because he meant to, but because his legs folded of their own accord. And in that stillness he began to speak, not aloud, but inwardly, pouring his thoughts into the place she had filled. I saw you too late. I heard you too late. I held you, but not tightly enough. He reached into the satchel, unsure what he hoped to find, and pulled from it a folded piece of cloth. Inside was a simple note, no more than a scrap of parchment, written in her handwriting, so careful, so clean it looked more like drawing than ink. Not all gold glitters. Some are sent only to measure your soul. His hand trembled. His eyes did not water. They burned. Outside, the hills stood still. The sky above them bled into dusk, and as the last of the sun disappeared behind the ridge, Edric understood that love does not always arrive with thunder, nor leave with rage. Sometimes it comes quietly, teaches gently, and departs only after you have learned to miss it. You've just heard the story of the woman from Hollow Brook, a tale not just of love, but of sight. Not the kind of sight that comes from the eyes, but the kind that flows from the heart. Because sometimes the greatest mistake we make in life is not that we break something fragile, but that we fail to recognize it was precious in the first place. So here's a word of advice. Don't wait for the world to praise someone before you choose to value them. Let your love not be reactive, but prophetic. See the worth in people before the world tells you they're worth seeing. Some gifts don't come wrapped in gold or loud laughter. Some come wrapped in silence, stillness, and grace. Don't be the person who calls it weakness when it's actually wisdom. Don't let pride blind you to presence. Cherish the quiet ones, the strange ones, the ones who love you in soft ways, because they may be angels in disguise, or healing you didn't know you needed, or peace sent to test whether you know what peace really looks like. And if you've already lost someone you failed to value, don't drown in guilt. Learn. Grow. Become the kind of person who won't miss it next time. We thank you for the unseen treasures you place in our lives. For the people who carry quiet strength, gentle love, and deep wisdom. Even when we are too loud, too proud, or too blind to notice. Open our eyes, Lord. Not just the ones in our heads, but the eyes of our hearts. Let us not miss the beauty wrapped in silence. Let us not mock what we do not understand. Let us never again call a gift a burden, nor a blessing a leech. Teach us to speak with honor, factious to Bacjana Galangton, Worthy child mics, the first tool, to touch us honor, tells to speak with honor. To love without conditions, and points clearature, for the oath or vote. To love man to puffer, fin to files with age intentions, swift and tough conditions, choice for a compassion sit the shed a forge, ambitions. To protect without pride. Hide where techness, a full par cried abetting to her cried the next bears base and ungamactiness. To protect without pride and beg for its soul's crowds, search without words pedigree histories. The opposite, if when is a pet of time, but not your base you. For it says, hold full to turtles. And to listen without needing applause. Where we have failed others, forgive us. Where we have misjudged, correct us. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.